Early this year, Centrify commissioned a Forrester study in which Forrester went ahead and surveyed over 200 enterprise customers. And they found out that the more mature identity and access management practice the customer has or the enterprise has, the less likely are they to experience a breach. Now, in the context of integrating our data or our audit events into the ecosystem, in particular into the SIEMs, where it fits in is in the last stage, in the audit everything stage. In my first session around SIEM integrations, I'd want to spend a few minutes explaining or going through all the audit events that we have across all the identity services platform that Centrify has. I would start off with the Centrify Service Suite or Centrify Infrastructure Services to start with, and the documentation is publicly available. I'm looking at the latest version of Centrify Service Suite, which is part of our infrastructure services offering. And I would then go into both application services as well as endpoint services. Some of the data, especially in terms of who is doing what, right? With that, let me start with showing you some of the key events that the Centrify infrastructure services sort of provides out of the box, right? What I'm looking at is the guide that is publicly available, and I'm looking at the latest release of Centrify infrastructure services. There are about 20 categories of events that we capture natively in both local syslogs or Windows event logs. So for example, some of the notable ones are, for example, advanced monitoring. So advanced monitoring helps you capture all the program executions, all the file system modifications. So for example, you can whitelist a set of directories, and you can subscribe to any changes that happened within that directory. So that's what advanced monitoring helps you with. There are DZ-Do, which helps you capture all the privilege elevations that happen on Linux or Unix machines, and privilege service on the Windows is very similar to DZ-Do on Linux or Unix, but on Windows machine, and we capture all the elevations that happen on Windows machine. So multi-factor authentication is another category of events that are interesting to us because we help make MFA much more mainstream, even for both logon as well as privilege elevation on the servers. And MFA category here kind of captures that event. So a typical MFA event would look something like this, right? So it would look like for every challenge we produce, okay, who is the user? If you have Direct Audit installed, which is part of our infrastructure service enterprise edition, then you would also have which installation of DA is this particular session associated with, is this particular session captured in, right? And the way we think about event capturing is we want the entire state of that particular event, of that particular activity to captured within the event, so that when we give this event to, let's say, an SIEM like a Splunk or an ArcSight or an IBM, we want them to make sense out of this event. So we put in as much information around the identity, who has done what within the event to help with that goal. So next, let's cover some of the key events out of Centrify Privilege Service, which is an extension to the Centrify infrastructure services that I've covered just a little while ago, right? So some of the key events, and by the way, you can get to these events, again, they can be publicly accessible through this URL here. Some of the key or the notable events are you have events that are generated when you can remotely log in into a service, into a server leveraging the CPS portal. when you do account checkout, when you do an account checkout, or when you do a workflow action, right? So all of these things would produce events natively as part of our identity services platform. So just to dive in, so if you look at some of the key account events, so you can see that there are events around, for example, password, whenever there is a password being checked out, right? So there is this thing called password export event that is being generated. Whenever there is a session start, right? So remotely, when you, for example, remotely log in into a session, whether it is an SSH session, RDP session, and so forth, you can look at the session start event as well. And then if someone, an administrator, for example, terminates a session, you can look at a session terminate event as well, right? So those are all around accounts. Now, the same logic also applies for domain events, multiplexed events, and so forth. CPS style events, for example, are whenever someone launches the CPS service, Centrify privilege service, as part of the identity services platform, this particular event is generated, right? So the next thing is application events, right? So every time a user is accessing a particular application, which by the way is powered by Centrify identity services, then we produce application events. So the typical application events would be whenever, for example, a user is launching Salesforce, there would be a Salesforce app launch event. Now, if the app is a completely cloud-based app, then you would get an app launch event. If it is powered by something on-prem, so for example, we have Confluence that runs, or Jira that runs on-prem, then it would be a gateway app launch event, and so forth, right? Similarly, even as part of our endpoint services, we generate a bunch of events, right? So we have events whenever a device is enrolled, right? You have a device enroll event, right? Whenever, for example, an app has changed, right? As part of the installation, we generate this, and so forth. So the key thing out of all of that is the documentation is publicly available. So we have, for our infrastructure services, which is part of our shared user password management solution, right? So we have this document, and for all the endpoint services, the application services, and CPS, which is part of infrastructure services, this is the URL that you could reference to learn more.